What was striking, and what is always striking in the case of the Swiss Civil Society Platform on Migration and Development, is the diversity of organizations that are around the table, the diversity of experiences, work experiences, the diversity of focuses that are around the table. Organizations around the table work on different issues, different dimensions. May we speak about labor migration in the south or integration in the Gemeinde of Basel. Organizations also work on different moments of the migration cycle, at different stages of migration. May that be in support of refugees or displaced people in refugee camps in the south, or may that be with returnees, may that be with candidates to migration in order to develop their skills or to prepare them to the migration cycle. So another element of diversity within these organizations, diversity of moments within the migration cycle where they work. And they work in different locations in Switzerland, different levels in Switzerland, different countries, in the south, in the north, in countries of origin, countries of destination, sometimes bridging between the two of them. So now I'll try to go a bit into the, let's say, main reflections or observations, experiences shared in these different tables, and try to link it a bit to some of the key policy implications one could identify. The objective here is not to make an exhaustive, comprehensive listing of neither the discussion nor the profile of the organizations that were around the table, but rather to give you a glimpse of the main dimensions that were brought. So it's not a hierarchy, and there is no attempt to be holistic and comprehensive. Starting with human rights, the human rights table linked with integration and inclusion. So already a very broad topic, or broad topics in plural. We could see first, interestingly, a lot of organizations trying to support the effective access of communities, of migrants, of children to rights, to their rights. May that be, once again, in the north or in the south. One example in mind, support to domestic workers in India. How can they claim their rights? Are they aware of their rights and the country, the context in which they live and can claim their rights? So that would be, or that was one of the examples given. Other dimensions covered under this discussion within this table, child protection, examples given, for instance, in the case of West Africa. What are the standards? What are the rules applicable? What are the deficiencies? What sort of mechanism can be developed to better support the protection of children in countries, or that example was in the south. Other examples of projects rather relating to integration, integration in that particular case in Switzerland, organizations working to support building, I would say, bridges between communities, trying to support the integration of arriving communities, older, younger generation within their context, always in a way to allow these actors or these people to become actually actors of their own development first and actors of development. So a lot of organizations working on access to education, for instance. A big reflection, or a big axis always being mentioned here around this table, but also in other tables about changing perceptions. I think this is something that came already in the introductory talks. The current remaining pertaining bias when it comes to the benefits or the cost of migration and the actual contribution, rights, situation of migrants. Sorry, yeah. So within this table, or at this table, projects already referring to the importance of including these awareness raising, this change of perceptions within their activities. Two policy implications came a lot, or came explicitly within the discussions. First of all, when one speaks about human rights, about the rights of of migrants wherever they are. Principles, a lot of standards do already exist. So the question is often how to make sure that these standards are actually being effectively followed, being effectively implemented. Of course, then there is the question of complementing these standards. But a big part of the discussion was already on how do we make sure that the existing standards are applied. And another axis, perhaps as food for thought for the podium discussion, what policies to better support integration of migrants communities at different levels. Lots of good practices, interesting practices being shared around the table. What about their replication? What about their replication? May that be at the communal level, may that be at the national level. So that's for some reflections on the first table. On labor migration, I attended two particular contributions. One of an organization working in the south on labor migration. So when I say in the south, let's say between South Asia and the Middle East, and on the issues that are relating to these migration patterns, and on the questions linked to ensuring the protection, once again, of human rights, labor rights of the workers, of the migrant workers. And we saw or discovered, learned about practices on how to support the access of these migrants to their rights, how to better support their preparation to migration if they decide to migrate. Part of the discussion also on ensuring the respect of labor rights and human rights and equal rights of migrants within Switzerland. So here, two policy implications. The potential of migration, often recognized, and its contribution to the development of countries of destination, for sure, origin, and migrants and their families, often recognized, but what about the framework conditions? What about the policies that allow this contribution of migrants to development to actually take place? And another axis of policy implication, I would say, what about the responsibilities of all the actors around the table? We spoke and we speak about international cooperation, about standards, about the responsibilities of the states, the issue of the employer's participation, of the private sector contribution to ensuring labor rights, to ensuring decent work, were also questioned. So here, as part of the coming discussion, or as a source of inspiration for the coming discussion, the question of this multi-stakeholder approach in practice. And what about the role, for instance, of the private sector? Third table, contribution of the diaspora to sustainable development. Here, this table is, I would say, both a topic, referring both to a topic and to a critical dimension of the so-called migration and development nexus. Diaspora is often referred in many of the hypotheses, working hypotheses of migration and development. The diaspora, we saw this morning, while the concept is, or the definition of the concept is, are several, let's say, or several understandings or self-perceptions of the diaspora. It can also actually relate to a group, and we saw it when it comes to the participants around the table. A lot of people taking part in these discussions were representative of, or representatives, were members of the diaspora. Lots of activities here, again, on building bridges. Building bridges within their communities, within the arriving community, or the foreign-born or or the community of foreign origin. Building bridges also between communities, between a foreign-born community and a national community. Mediation activities were also being mentioned, mediation activities between one community and the local or national authorities. Lots of ideas, initiatives also on supporting, on the linkages between diaspora and their country of origin, and on supporting economic or human development in the countries of origin. A lot of ambitions also to build these bridges, to allow not only investments, but also capacities, knowledge to be transferred in the countries of origin. We spoke also about the change of perceptions in the country of origin. Sorry. And additional elements that was mentioned, for instance, by Ramla this morning, how to support these ambitions. So some organizations already trying to support their fellow colleagues from the diaspora to put themselves in a capacity to project themselves as actors of development, to put themselves in a situation to support development processes in the countries of origin. So capacity building activities here. So here the policy implication, I would say, is rather obvious, automatic. How to better tap from all this knowledge, how to better tap in these capacities, in these accumulated competencies, knowledge from the diaspora, while also, as mentioned by Ramla this morning, acknowledging, recognizing the specificities of these groups, their capacities, financial capacities, and sometimes capacities to project themselves as an organization. That would be for the diaspora table. Last table, forced migration. Lots of issues mentioned here again. I'll mention two to be brief. Organizations referring to their work in support of displaced people in distress, in support of, for instance, refugees, of displaced populations. The Syrian crisis was mentioned as an example. And here already the policy implication, what happens after the short-term support is being provided? How do we bridge between short-term needs and longer-term perspective? How do we make sure that a supposedly temporary situation remains temporary and leads to a next step of to longer-term perspective for the populations that are involved? On forced migration, a lot of discussion also on the question of root causes. How do we support or prevent forced migration and make sure it remains a decision? Discussion on resilience to climate change, to promoting good governance, Friedensförderung, violence reduction. So that was one aspect covered when we speak about forced migration and the so-called root causes of migration. Elements also of what happens if. So what happens if this resilience, what happens if this work on the root causes, or this support on preventing root causes for migration to happen, actually do happen? What about the current state of international protection? Are all the forced displaced population covered by international law? Answering the question is one way of already answering it. So question of protection gaps was already alluded to. That's one policy implication that I would mention coming from this discussion, how to remedy these protection gaps. What about these very probably soon to come forced displaced as a result of climate change? What are the obligations of the international community, of individual states, of the population communities themselves and their rights? And the other one on the link between short-term emergency response and longer-term perspective was already mentioned. So that's for what I would call thematic table discussion, so the harvest of some of the experiences and some of the reflections on policy implications that were given. That's one aspect, but based also from this discussion, one could already extract a couple of general remarks, general observations, I would say as food for thought for the coming podium discussion. So a couple of axis elements that were, for instance, already at the core of the policy briefs that the Swiss Civil Society platform drafted on the occasion of the start of the Global Compact consultations. First, forgive me for the use of the acronym. The discussions in all the tables refer to existing standards, refer to existing processes. So one legitimate expectation, I would say, when it comes to the coming discussions on the Global Compact on Migration, that's what the GCM stands for, is to be and to happen in continuity with ongoing discussions with ongoing frameworks to happen in articulation and to be firmly anchored, for instance, in the human rights framework, international human rights framework, or the Sustainable Development Goals process, so the so-called Agenda 2030. And as it is the case for the Agenda 2030, the need or the call for policy coherence we saw in the case of the different discussions and also in the introductory talks this morning. Can't remember whether it was Professor Cotier or Markus Reisler that spoke about the linkages between agriculture and migration. What about those interlinkages? What about the implications of our policies, internal or external policy on agriculture and impact on migration? What about humanitarian policies and development policies and trade policies and so on? So a call for considering or for approaching the discussions on the Global Compact on migration, once again, under the lens of policy coherence, coherence of policies, domestic policies, and coherence between external policies. With the following of the, or while following the negotiations, the consultations and the negotiations on the Global Compact on migration, one can clearly see that we will most probably not go for a legally binding document. So while regretting it, we also welcome the position of many member states, UN member states, asking for the Global Compact to be as, I would say, concrete, operational as possible. So rather than restating universally recognized standards, moving to the next step, being concrete and moving into the operationalization of these standards. What are the concrete commitments that the member states take through the Global Compact to implement rights? What are the measurable objectives, timelines attached to this action plan, and what are the reporting mechanisms attached to this action plan? Leave no one behind. This is the motto of the SDGs. This is something we wanted to repeat just before the podium discussion. Will the Global Compact on migration leave also no one behind? What about these protection gaps that some of the tables refer to? Will the Global Compact on migration be able to answer this, or will at least Switzerland position itself in a situation to remedy these gaps within the coming discussions? Multi-stakeholder approach, this is something that we as civil society also want to throw to the podium discussion, and the importance of not only including civil society, as it was the case in the consultations, but also in the implementation of the coming Global Compact, perhaps also in the reporting, monitoring. Civil society is one, I would say, category or subcategory of non-state actors. What about those employers that some of the tables refer to? What about the private sector? What about the obligations of the private sector to be a proactive actor on this, on the implementation, on the definition and implementation of the Global Compact? And with that, I'd like to end with a general remark that I could extract from the discussion, seeing that, yes, discussion focus on practices, on experiences of all of our organizations. A lot of our organizations do not work on the international level, are linked to organizations that may advocate on the international level, but that primarily works on the national, sometimes communal level. Saying this is also a way to remind that the ambassador is attracting to all the attention now. Repeating this is also a way to say that the Global Compact will be implemented at national level. Hence the importance also to involve the civil society in national policies, discussions on migration and development, and the possibility also for states such as Switzerland to be a role model and to implement its policies no matter what is being decided at the international level. So that's for some of the thoughts we'd like to throw to the panel discussions and to the panel discussants. I won't make it. So now I see that everybody's here and ready and eager to discuss at podium level. So I'll pass the ball now to the Moderatorin.
Thank you.